Olivia Parker had once believed her love with Ethan Lancaster was unbreakable. She had stood by him when he was just a man with dreams, before he became a billionaire, before power and pride consumed him. But one night changed everything. A single photograph, a whispered rumor, a cold accusation. Ethan refused to listen, refused to trust her. And so, Olivia made the only choice she could. She walked away. She left behind the wealth, the luxury, and the man who had once meant everything to her. With nothing but her name and her strength, she disappeared, determined to build a new life on her own. She thought it was the end of their story. Ethan Lancaster had spent his entire life chasing success. Born into poverty, he had clawed his way to the top, building his empire through sheer determination and an unshakable belief in himself. Now, at 35, he was one of the wealthiest men in the country. A self-made billionaire with the world at his feet. Yet, despite all his power, there was one thing he had lost. And no amount of money could ever bring it back. Olivia Parker had been with Ethan before the world knew his name. She had met him when he was nothing but a struggling entrepreneur. A man with more ambition than money. More dreams than certainty. She had believed in him when no one else did. When he had been turned away by investors, she had encouraged him to keep going. When he had come home exhausted, doubting himself, she had reminded him why he started. She had been his rock, his safe place, the one person who never wavered, even when success seemed impossible. And when he finally made it, when the world saw him as a force to be reckoned with, Olivia had remained by his side, not because of his wealth, not because of the luxury, but because she had loved him long before any of it. She had thought their love was unbreakable. She had been wrong. The night Ethan ended their marriage, the rain poured relentlessly, lashing against the windows of their grand estate. Olivia stood in the foyer, her breath uneven, her fingers trembling as she clutched the divorce papers he had just placed on the glass table between them. The sight of them sent a chill through her body. She lifted her gaze to Ethan, searching his face for answers, for a sign that this was all some terrible misunderstanding. But the man who had once looked at her with love and devotion now stared back with cold detachment. She could hardly recognize him. "Ethan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you doing this?" He didn't respond right away. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out a folded photograph, and tossed it onto the table. Olivia hesitated before picking it up. As soon as she saw the image, her breath caught in her throat. It was a picture of her, sitting at a restaurant with a man. From the angle of the shot, it looked like an intimate conversation. It looked like betrayal. But it wasn't. Her stomach twisted in realization. "This isn't what it looks like," she said immediately, looking up at Ethan, desperation creeping into her voice. He let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "That's exactly what guilty people say." Frustration burned in her chest. "It's an old friend, Ethan. That's all." His expression didn't change. "You expect me to believe that?" She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. "Yes. Because it's the truth." Ethan shook his head. His jaw clenched. "I trusted you, Olivia." His words struck her harder than any accusation could. She stepped closer, her hands gripping the edge of the table. "Then trust me now." Silence. He didn't speak. He didn't soften. He just stood there, looking at her as if she was someone he no longer knew. And that hurt more than anything. She had stood by him through every failure, every disappointment. She had given him everything, her time, her love, her unwavering support. And yet, at the first whisper of doubt, at the first shred of supposed evidence, he had believed a photograph over her. She had spent years proving her loyalty, her love, and still, it wasn't enough. Her hands curled into fists. After everything we've been through, you're really going to throw this away? Throw us away over a single picture? Ethan didn't answer. His silence said everything. A sharp, hollow pain spread through her chest. She let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. I stood by you when you had nothing, Ethan. I loved you when the world ignored you. I was there when you failed, when you doubted yourself, when you wanted to give up. I gave you everything. And this, she gestured at the photograph, her voice breaking, is all it takes for you to stop believing in me. Still, nothing. A part of her wanted to keep fighting, to make him see reason. But another part of her, the part that was exhausted, the part that had given and given and given, knew that it didn't matter. Because if he had truly loved her, he never would have doubted her in the first place. She inhaled sharply, forcing back the tears threatening to fall. If you loved me, she said, her voice quieter now, more resigned, you would believe me. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. And that was all the answer she needed. She let out a shaky breath, blinking rapidly to hold back the sting in her eyes. Then, with slow, deliberate movements, she reached for the divorce papers. She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She simply picked up the pen and signed. She saw the flicker of surprise in Ethan's eyes, as if he had expected more resistance, as if some part of him had wanted her to fight for him. But she was done fighting for someone who had already made his choice. She set the pen down and straightened her shoulders. I don't want your money, Ethan. He frowned slightly, as if thrown off by her words. I don't want the settlement, the penthouse, or your stocks. Her voice was steady now. I never wanted your money. I only ever wanted you. A shadow crossed his face. But it was too late. She turned and walked away, not waiting for a response. She left the mansion, the life they had built, the man she had once believed in. And she never looked back. 2 weeks later, Olivia stepped off a train in a quiet town, far from the chaos of New York. Her entire life had changed in a matter of days. She had left behind luxury, security, familiarity. Now, she had no home, no plan, no idea what the future held. But for the first time in a long time, she was free. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore, a far cry from the grand estate she once lived in. The landlord, a kind elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson, had taken one look at her tired face and offered her a place without hesitation. That night, Olivia sat on the small bed in her new home, wrapping her arms around herself. She had no regrets. She had done the right thing. And yet, as she placed a protective hand over her stomach, though she didn't know it yet, her body was already whispering a truth that would change her life forever. A new beginning was growing inside her. The first few weeks in Maplewood, Illinois, were a blur for Olivia. The transition from the life she once had to this new, simpler existence was both jarring and liberating. Gone were the grand hallways of the Lancaster estate, the luxury cars, the extravagant dinners at five-star restaurants. Instead, she found herself waking up in a modest one-bedroom apartment above a charming little bookstore. where the scent of fresh pages and brewed coffee filled the air every morning. She had found a job at the local elementary school as a literature teacher. Something she had always loved, but had set aside during her marriage. Teaching had always been a dream buried beneath the weight of Ethan's ambitions. She had spent years supporting him, helping build his empire, forgetting that she had once had dreams of her own. Now, as she stood in front of her small class, reading to eager children with bright, curious eyes, she felt a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. She was rebuilding herself, piece by piece. Yet, just as she had begun to feel like she had control over her life again, everything changed. It started with exhaustion. More than the usual tiredness that came with adjusting to a new job and a new place. Olivia found herself feeling drained, dizzy at times, unable to focus as much as she used to. She brushed it off at first, thinking it was just stress catching up to her. But then came the nausea. She would wake up feeling sick, her stomach twisting uncomfortably at the scent of certain foods. Then, one morning, while helping her students with an art project, a wave of dizziness hit her so hard that she had to grip the edge of a desk to steady herself. Concerned, her colleague, Mrs. Thompson, a kind older woman who had been teaching at the school for years, suggested she see a doctor. Stress can do strange things to the body. "Dear?" she had said, squeezing Olivia's hand. "But you should get checked." "Just in case," Olivia agreed, thinking it was probably nothing. She couldn't have been more wrong. Sitting in the small clinic later that week, Olivia felt her heart pound as the doctor gave her the results. "You're pregnant," the doctor said gently, watching Olivia's reaction closely. The words echoed in her mind. Pregnant. Her breath hitched. Her hands instinctively went to her stomach. A baby. No. Not just a baby. "Wait," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Did you say babies?" The doctor smiled. "Yes. Twins." The room spun. Olivia had prepared herself for the possibility of being pregnant, after all. She and Ethan had never been careful toward the end of their marriage. But the idea of twins had never even crossed her mind. She barely registered the doctor's reassurances, the explanations of what to expect. She only heard one thing. She was going to be a mother. And Ethan Lancaster would never know. The weight of the realization pressed down on her during the days that followed. She had left behind a life of security, of wealth, of comfort. She had walked away from a man whose fortune could have provided her children with everything. But she had also walked away from a man who didn't trust her. A man who had thrown her away without hesitation. No. She wouldn't let herself regret it. She was scared, overwhelmed. But she would not break. She had made it on her own this far, she would do it for her children, too. Word spread quickly in Maplewood, as it always did in small towns. Soon, Olivia found herself on the receiving end of kindness from people she barely knew. Mrs. Thompson, her fellow teacher, became a motherly figure, always checking in on her. Her landlord, the elderly bookstore owner, began leaving fresh bread outside her door, as if sensing she needed the extra care. And then there was Daniel, the young mechanic who lived a few doors down, who insisted on fixing anything in her apartment that even looked like it might break. "You're going to need all the help you can get," he said with a boyish grin when she protested. "Besides, my mom raised me to help a lady in need." At first, Olivia struggled to accept their kindness. She had spent years standing in Ethan's shadow, used to doing things for someone? Not receiving help herself. But slowly, she let herself lean into it. For the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of the world alone. As the months passed, Olivia prepared herself for what was to come. She turned the small second bedroom in her apartment into a nursery, painting the walls a soft pastel blue and yellow. She bought second-hand baby clothes, accepting gifts from neighbors who had outgrown theirs. She spent nights reading parenting books, researching everything she could about raising twins on her own. And through it all, she felt a deep, unwavering love growing within her. She hadn't planned for this. She hadn't expected it. But she would give these babies everything she had. She would be their mother, their protector, their world. And they would never need to know about the man who had walked away. The night Olivia gave birth was both the most painful and the most miraculous moment of her life. Labor had been long and exhausting, stretching nearly 20 hours. The small hospital in Maplewood wasn't as luxurious as the private facilities she once had access to in New York. But the care was warm, personal. The nurses encouraged her through every contraction. And Mrs. Thompson, her closest friend in town, never left her side. When the first cry filled the room, Olivia's entire world shifted. A baby boy. And minutes later, another. A baby girl. 2 tiny miracles. 2 new lives? As she held them for the first time, Aiden swaddled in blue, Emma in pink, tears streamed down her face. She traced their delicate features, their tiny hands curling around her finger. It was overwhelming. The love she felt for them. It was different from anything she had ever known, deeper, fiercer. She had never felt more exhausted, more vulnerable. But she had also never felt stronger. The first few months were relentless. Late-night feedings, sleepless nights, constant crying. Olivia had expected it. But nothing could have truly prepared her for the exhaustion that came with raising twins alone. There were nights she collapsed onto the couch, too tired to do anything but stare at the ceiling, questioning how she would keep going. But then Aiden would grip her finger, or Emma would nuzzle into her neck. And suddenly, every sleepless night, every moment of exhaustion, was worth it. The town of Maplewood embraced her in ways she had never expected. Mrs. Thompson watched the babies whenever Olivia needed a break, rocking them gently in her arms as she hummed old lullabies. Her landlord, Mrs. Everett, insisted on bringing homemade soup and fresh bread every week, claiming that a tired mother shouldn't have to cook. And Daniel, the kind mechanic who had always helped her, installed safety locks on her doors and even built the twins a wooden crib with his own hands. "You're not alone, Olivia," he reminded her whenever he saw doubt in her eyes. At first, it had been hard to accept help. She had always been the one supporting someone else, Ethan, his business, his dreams. Now, she was the one receiving support. But she was learning. She wasn't weak for accepting kindness. She was strong for doing whatever it took to raise her children. As the years passed, Olivia built a life. She balanced teaching and motherhood, adjusting her schedule to ensure she was there for every milestone: first words, first steps, first scraped knees. She was there when Emma whispered her first mama in the soft morning light, when Aiden clapped his hands after taking his first wobbly steps. She was there for all of it. And yet, as much as she tried to focus on the present, the past had a way of creeping in. Aiden, with his sharp, intelligent eyes, studied everything with the same intensity as Ethan once did. He observed before he acted, as if calculating every move. Emma, with her confident stride and knowing smirk, carried the same stubborn determination as her father. Some days, Olivia caught herself staring at them too long, feeling the ache of memories she tried to bury. They had Ethan's mannerisms, his expressions, his unshakable presence, and yet, he would never know them. She had chosen this. She had chosen to walk away. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the world was still, she wondered, if Ethan had known about them, would he have cared? Meanwhile, miles away in New York, Ethan Lancaster was a man who had everything, except the one thing that mattered. Years had passed, yet his life remained unchanged. Work, meetings, deals, expansion. His company had doubled in size. His wealth had tripled. His name was more powerful than ever. But when the sun set and the world went quiet, all he had was an empty penthouse and the memory of a woman he had let slip through his fingers. At first, he had convinced himself that he was better off, that Olivia had betrayed him, that he had been right to let her go. But doubt had a way of creeping in. The night she walked out of his life replayed in his mind more times than he cared to admit. Her words haunted him. "If you loved me, you would believe me." Had she told the truth? Had he made a mistake? The questions gnawed at him. More than once, he had hired private investigators to find her. Every time, they came back with the same answer. She was gone. No trace. No forwarding address. No presence in the high society she had once been part of. It was as if she had vanished. And that realization, more than anything, unsettled him. Because Ethan Lancaster had built an empire, controlled markets, shaped industries. Yet, he couldn't find the one woman who had ever truly mattered. And for the first time in his life, he felt powerless. Back in Maplewood, Olivia rocked Emma to sleep, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's forehead. Aidan slept peacefully in his crib, his tiny chest rising and falling. She should have felt content. She was content. And yet, somewhere deep inside, a whisper of the past lingered. Ethan was gone, but his presence would never truly leave. And she wondered, was the past really as far behind her as she wanted to believe? Years had passed, and life in Maplewood had settled into a comfortable rhythm for Olivia and her children. Aidan and Emma were now 5 years old, bright, curious, and full of energy. They had inherited their mother's warmth but unmistakably carried their father's sharp intelligence and commanding presence. Olivia had built a stable, loving home for them. She had found happiness in teaching, in watching her children grow, in the little moments that made up their lives. She rarely thought about Ethan anymore. Or at least, that's what she told herself. But fate had a cruel way of bringing the past back when least expected. It was a perfect spring afternoon, the kind that made everything feel light and full of possibility. Olivia decided to take Aidan and Emma to the nearest shopping mall, a rare treat for them. The twins were thrilled, bouncing with excitement as they held their mother's hands, chattering about the ice cream shop they wanted to visit, and the toys they hoped to see. The mall was bustling with families, shoppers, and people enjoying the warm weather. Olivia was laughing as Emma tugged on her sleeve, demanding a trip to the bookstore, while Aidan, ever the thinker, carefully examined a toy train display. Everything felt normal. Until it wasn't. She felt it before she saw it, a presence, a shift in the air, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. Then, she turned her head. And there he was. Ethan Lancaster. Standing just a few feet away. Looking directly at her. For a second, Olivia couldn't breathe. The world seemed to narrow. The noise of the crowded mall fading into the background. Ethan looked almost exactly the same, tall. Powerful. Exuding the same effortless confidence he always had. But there was something different about him now. A weariness in his eyes. A flicker of something unreadable. Shock. Disbelief. And then? His gaze shifted. To Aidan? To Emma? To the two small children who looked like perfect reflections of himself. Olivia saw it happen, the moment Ethan put the pieces together. The realization crashing over him like a tidal wave. His eyes widened. His breath caught. His entire body tensed. Aidan. Oblivious? Frowned at the stranger staring at him. Tilting his head the way he always did when he was deep in thought, just like Ethan. Emma. More perceptive. Sensed something was off and moved closer to Olivia. Gripping her mother's hand tightly. Ethan took a step forward. His voice low. Almost unsteady. Olivia. She held her ground? Her heart pounding. He looked from her to the children again. And when he spoke, his voice was barely a whisper. They're mine. It wasn't a question. It was a statement. A truth so undeniable that even he, with all his logic and reason, couldn't argue against it. Olivia inhaled sharply, steadying herself before responding. Yes. The weight of that single word settled between them. Ethan's hands clenched at his sides. His mind racing. 5 years. 5 years of searching for her, of wondering where she had gone, of questioning if he had been wrong to let her go. And all this time? She had been raising his children without him. Why didn't you tell me? Ethan's voice was tight, filled with something between anger and pain. Olivia met his gaze. Her own eyes fierce and unyielding. You didn't want to listen to me back then. Ethan, she said quietly but firmly. You made your choice? His jaw tightened. I deserved to know. She let out a breath, shaking her head. Did you? Ethan froze. You didn't believe me, Olivia continued, her voice unwavering. You threw me away without a second thought. You had every opportunity to listen, to trust me. But you didn't. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I was wrong, he admitted. I see that now. Olivia let out a soft, bitter laugh. Well? It's a little late for that. Isn't it? Ethan glanced back at the children, his children. Aidan had his sharp, calculating gaze. Emma had his confidence, his unwavering determination. They were his, and he had missed everything. Their first steps. Their first words. Their entire lives. His stomach twisted. I never stopped looking for you, he confessed. I tried to find you. Olivia's expression didn't change. And what would you have done if you had? Ethan hesitated. He didn't have an answer. Would he have fought for her? For them? Or would his pride have gotten in the way again? The truth was, he didn't know. And that uncertainty was enough for Olivia. She squared her shoulders, looking him straight in the eye. They have had a good life without you, Ethan. A happy life. They don't need you. The words were a gut punch. But he knew he deserved them. Aidan pulled at Olivia's sleeve. Mama. Who's that? Ethan's chest tightened at the word Mama. She was their entire world. And he was nothing but a stranger. Olivia's voice was soft but firm. No one. Sweetheart. Just someone from the past. Ethan's heart clenched. Just someone from the past. He had never felt more powerless in his life. He watched as Olivia took her children's hands and walked away without looking back. And for the first time, Ethan Lancaster realized what it truly meant to lose everything. The next morning, Olivia was in the kitchen preparing breakfast when a knock echoed through the quiet house. Her heart stilled. She knew. Even before she opened the door. She knew. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked it and pulled it open, only to find Ethan Lancaster standing there. He looked different from the man she had seen yesterday in the mall. Gone was the composed, distant billionaire. Standing before her now was a man who looked uncertain. Almost vulnerable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Ethan exhaled. Olivia. Please. Let me talk to you. Her fingers tightened around the doorknob. Every part of her told her to shut the door. To send him away. She had spent years rebuilding her life without him. But then she thought of Aiden and Emma. What if they deserved to know their father? What if, despite everything, Ethan deserved to know them? With a sigh, she stepped aside. Come in. Ethan stepped inside. His gaze immediately scanning the cozy home. It was nothing like the world they had once shared, the extravagant estate. The luxury. The space that had always felt too empty. This was different. The living room was filled with warmth. Family photos lined the walls. Some of Olivia holding the twins as babies. Others of Aiden and Emma playing in the backyard. Their toys were scattered around the floor. Books, stacked messily on a nearby table. It was lived in. It was real. And Ethan felt the weight of everything he had missed. He turned back to Olivia. His voice raw. You did all this. Without me. She met his gaze evenly. I didn't have a choice. Ethan swallowed hard. I should have been here. Olivia let out a quiet laugh. Shaking her head. Yes. You should have. Silence stretched between them. Heavy with things left unsaid. Ethan hesitated before finally speaking. I made a mistake. Olivia. The biggest mistake of my life. She crossed her arms. Watching him carefully. And what do you expect me to do with that? Ethan. Just. Forgive you. His jaw tightened. But his voice was steady. No. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't deserve that. He looked down for a moment. Then back at her. But I do want a chance? A chance to know them. Olivia's breath caught. This was the moment she had feared. Letting him in meant risking everything. It meant opening up wounds she had worked so hard to heal. It meant the possibility of him walking away again. She couldn't let that happen. Not to her. Not to their children. But before she could respond, a small voice interrupted. Mama. Both of them turned to see Aiden standing in the doorway, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Ethan froze. For the first time, he was seeing his son up close. Not from a distance. Not in a fleeting glance. Aiden looked at Ethan with curiosity. His sharp eyes studying him, just like Ethan had always studied the world. Emma appeared beside her brother. Blinking up at Ethan. Who's that? Ethan took an unsteady breath and dropped to one knee, bringing himself to their level. He didn't want to overwhelm them. He didn't want to scare them. My name is Ethan, he said softly. Aiden tilted his head, frowning slightly. Ethan. There was a pause. Then, quietly, Ethan added. I'm your father. The words felt foreign on his tongue. But they were the truest thing he had ever spoken. Aidan's brows furrowed in thought, while Emma simply stared at him, assessing. Then, Emma turned to Olivia. Is that true, Mama? Olivia felt her chest tighten. She knelt beside them, gently brushing a curl from Emma's face. Yes, sweetheart. It's true. The children didn't say anything right away. And Ethan didn't push. He simply waited, letting them process it in their own time. Finally, Aidan broke the silence. Do you like dinosaurs? Ethan blinked. What? Aidan shrugged. I like dinosaurs. Mama says the T-Rex is the coolest. But I think raptors are cooler. For the first time in what felt like years, a small, genuine smile broke across Ethan's face. I think raptors are pretty cool too. Aidan studied him for a moment, then nodded approvingly. Okay. Emma stepped closer, still uncertain. Are you staying for breakfast? Ethan hesitated, glancing at Olivia. She had been watching the interaction. Her emotions a whirlwind of fear, hesitation, and something else. A part of her wanted to say no, to protect the life she had built. But then she saw something in Ethan's eyes, something she hadn't seen in years. Sincerity, regret, hope, and, for the first time since he walked away all those years ago, Olivia saw the man she had once loved. The man she had believed in. Maybe he had changed. Maybe it was too late. Or maybe, just maybe, it wasn't. She took a deep breath, then finally spoke. You can stay. Ethan's shoulders relaxed. Something like relief washing over his face. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't a promise. But it was a chance. And for now, that was enough. How do you feel about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your feedback to improve even more. If you enjoyed this content, don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our latest videos. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.